I'm a media commentator and columnist and troublemaker from the United States of America. I finished.
But
you said 3 words.
You have a speech.
Oh,
And start with the
okay.
introduction.
So I introduce myself.
Yes.
Some people need no introduction. Some people get no introduction. Fair enough. Welcome. I'm a columnist for National Review magazine. I'm a contributing writer for the Wall Street Journal, where I worked for 28 years, and I'm also a television commentator for Fox News Channel in the United States. I am going to do something a little different in this talk, partly because I see the number of young people in this room, and partly because, and I'll explain this later, I thought for a second I'd seen a ghost when I walked into this room about 15 minutes ago. Because most of you are young people, I would like to speak to you directly about the future of Ukraine. And we had a wonderful presentation yesterday in Kiev from the finance minister and from many of the distinguished panelists here. So my remarks will merge into those. But I first wanted to tell you a little story. Just over a quarter century ago, I had the privilege of covering the collapse of communism. I was based in Brussels for the Wall Street Journal Europe, and I had the privilege, and it was a privilege, to watch an entire continent change in front of my eyes over the course of 6 to 12 months, country after country, including Ukraine shortly thereafter. As you know, the symbol of the division between East and West in the 1980s was the Berlin Wall, an ugly scar across the city, dividing people, dividing families, symbolizing the different systems and their different stages of development. 5 years before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, I was in West Berlin for a conference, and a friend of mine from the German Foreign Ministry and I decided to cross over for the day into East Berlin. I had a conversational knowledge of German. I'm able to read articles in German but not write them. He, of course, was completely fluent in German. We went to the Museum of German History in East Berlin. You learn things there that you never thought you'd learn anywhere, including that television was invented by an East German in 1953. While we were walking through the history exhibits, some of them fanciful, some of them imaginary, we were approached by a group of school children, roughly 13 to 16 years of age, and they asked us what time it was. Well, in reality, they knew what time it was, they just wanted to talk to us. It turned out they were children from the countryside. This was their first visit to the capital. We were probably the first Westerners they'd ever seen. We asked them later, how in the world did you know we were from the West? And they said, very simple, we looked at your shoes. And because they were not made of plastic, we knew you were from somewhere else. So we were chatting with them. They were there on a school trip. And suddenly their teacher came. And we were clearly a disruptive influence. We were clearly a danger to them. The teacher said, it is time we leave immediately. And we did. They did. A couple hours later, we were walking through Centrum Warenhaus, which is the leading department store in East Berlin. Think of the department store in downtown Lviv, except there's no inventory. And only people from the city could buy things in that department store. If you lived at an address outside of the city, you could not buy things there. It's how they reserved privileges for the elite. Suddenly, the school children were there, again, by accident. Their teacher had let them go for the day because the teacher wanted to go shopping and the teacher wanted to do things. So we were there and we exchanged information. It turned out that we knew their city far better than they did, so we took these 4 East German girls on a tour of their own capital, their own Hauptstadt. And we had a wonderful time. We showed them our passports. They showed us their Ausweise, their identification papers. We traded information. They were insatiably curious about the West. So finally the end of the day comes and it's time to go. Night is falling. We walked back to Friedrichstrasse station, and they had never seen the Berlin Wall. The whole day we had not been close enough to see the Berlin Wall. They had never seen it. But as we walked back to the train station where we had to cross over, they instinctively knew it was coming because they started walking more and more slowly. So finally, we got in sight of the Berlin Wall, and they stopped and said, it's probably better we not go any further. Someone might ask questions why we're so close to the zone. And I'll never forget, we had this conversation, and I had this very strange feeling because I was not a rich person. But I could, for a few $100s, go anywhere in the world from that street corner, travel anywhere. They could not go another 50 meters. And what struck me was how closed and limited their lives were going to be in this place. I actually referred to it as, it's almost as if we visited the zoo all day and you're the exhibits, but you can't leave. We've come and looked at you and been curious, but it's time for us to leave and you have to stay in the zoo. And so we were chatting there. We didn't want the moment to end, and I asked each of them what they wanted to be when they grew up, these 4 East German teenagers. And one of them said a hairdresser, and one of them said a nurse, one of them said a teacher, but the oldest and wisest was a girl named Monika. And I asked Monika what she wanted to be when she grew up. And she said, it doesn't really matter, no matter what we do when we grow up, they will always treat us as children here. They will always treat us as children. My heart was almost breaking. So we left, we exchanged addresses, and other than a couple of postcards in the next 5 years, never heard or thought much more about it. And then the big day came, which of course you, as young people, only know from the history books. I lived through it. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And watching from my office in New York City, I couldn't imagine the emotions of the people who were crossing over. And I thought, is one of them perhaps Monika? I knew she was studying or working in Berlin at the time. And then the next morning, I was woken up, time difference, it was 6 hours later, and it was a phone call. The unmistakable sign of a foreign phone call. Back then you could tell the difference between a foreign and a domestic call. And it was Monika. It turned out that capitalism works in mysterious ways. The U.S. telephone companies, AT&T, the German companies, Deutsche Telekom, knew that these were potential customers somehow. They had set up portable kiosks around Berlin to show people how a modern telephone worked, and they were offering one free phone call to anywhere in the world, to anyone who wanted to make one. So people were calling relatives and things, and Monika decided to go really far and call New York City, and she called me. So I picked up the phone and she said, "Here is Monika, I'm over the wall." And it was I could hear the world's greatest street party going on behind her. And we had a very brief chat, but I couldn't resist asking her. I reminded of the phone conversation we had on that street corner in East Berlin. And I asked her, well, do you think you're going to be treated as children now? Because obviously these were big changes happening in our country. And she paused and she said, I think my country has graduated from kindergarten to university overnight. Well, the story has a happy ending. She had been prevented from attending university because of political problems that she presented to the regime. She ended up studying to be a veterinarian. She's happily married, has children, wonderful life, and we still communicate occasionally. But that brings me to Ukraine today, because here's what I think the challenge is, having been part of this wonderful panel that you will hear, the challenges for Ukraine today. It's been 25 years since your independence, and you have accomplished much, and you have had many challenges that you have had to face that none of the former communist countries had to. None of the former communist countries have had to endure direct aggression by a foreign power. None of them have had a civil war and an invasion on their border regions. So you've had great challenges, but you've also had opportunities that you've not fully met. As the finance minister, Danieliuk, told us yesterday, it's time for us to stop talking in Parliament and time for us to start doing. And he mentioned the reform measures that are before Parliament on privatization, on transparency, on rule of law, on getting your fiscal house in order. My message to you, and I apologize because I always am fearful that I fall into the trap of being an outsider and a foreigner, even though I've been to Ukraine now 6 times. I realize how little I know about Ukraine simply by the number of times I've been here. Every time I come, I realize I know less than your complex society presents. But here's what I think I know. You, the young people in this room, you have the responsibility to tell the adults running Ukraine, it's time for you to stop acting like children. It's time for you to start acting like adults. It's time for you to be responsible. And the 25 years is long enough to grow up. It's time to reform Ukraine along universal values. What are those values? These are not American values. These are not British values. These are not German values. These are not Italian, French values. These are universal values. The rule of law, respect for private property, civil liberties, tolerance, opportunities for young people as opposed to stagnation or narrow tracking of them so that they don't have the full range of opportunities available to them. And here's why it's important for you as Ukrainian patriots. You know, there's an old saying in English, success is the best revenge. Well, success is the best revenge when it comes to the bear in the room. It's called Russia. Russia, as you know, has never fully accepted Ukraine leaving the embrace of the bear. You have to figure out a way to fully escape the embrace of the bear. Some of that is geopolitical, some of that is diplomatic, some of that is military, some of that is, though, economic. Your best chance for success is to develop the kind of strong, prosperous, free economy that will present real defenses against Russian incursions. A strong economy means a strong defense. It means also that you become a model, rather than the Russians, for countries around you. Moldova, even Belarus. I just came from Armenia. You can present a model as much as any country. You're all 50 million people. I believe that Ukraine's moment is now. Obviously, you have challenges of corruption, you have challenges of self-serving politicians, but you are a functioning democracy, and you as young people not only have a vote, but you have a voice in the future of your country. Seize this moment. Demand from your adult politicians, demand from the people who claim to represent you, that they not only represent you in your future, an expanded future, but that they start acting like adults and stop arguing and squabbling in Parliament like children. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for this very encouraging speech. I will ask every panelist to introduce himself 1 minute to say who they are, because organization-wise there have been some changes, so just to prevent confusion. Maybe building on what John has said, I have just read the article of Natalie Yaresko about the state of Ukraine and what has to be done. I read it in the plane. And I have to agree and I have to stress, given the circumstances Ukraine was in from 2000 or in 2014, it's been great what has been achieved, and I would like to join John. Yeah, please go on, don't stop, use your civil courage, yeah, not to let these people stop, who would like to reverse this and that. But coming to our theme, as a moderator, Brexit, Trump, maybe even Macron, maybe Germany, etc. So we are in turbulent times, and I would ask every of our panelists 5 minutes, a short statement, and I'm starting it one by one, and everybody please introduce yourself.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Richard Rahn. I was the former chief economist of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I served as the first non-Canadian on the Cayman Islands Board of Monetary Authority. I've created businesses in this part of the world. I've been with a number of think tanks, and I do a syndicated economic column each week. Like John, we've all written a lot. And I had noticed, even though I've published more than 1,000 articles, the world wasn't changing that much. So we decided to do some films about successful countries and how they could be a role model for others. And over the last 2 years, we did a film on Chile, one on Switzerland, one on Estonia. And with the encouragement of the Kriebel Foundation and Chris Fuskis and Tanya Bay, we have put together a TV show. And Tanya, is that being broadcast now here, or the TV show? Well, is that being broadcast now? Yeah, okay. Anyway, what we've done is put together some of the lessons that can be learned from Switzerland, Chile, and Estonia for the Ukrainian audience. It's all has been dubbed into Ukrainian, and I hope you all watch it because it'll give you indications of what can be done. For instance, as John pointed out, one of the keys for any economic development is getting rid of corruption. And that is something, of course, that has plagued your country. I don't have to tell you about that. But the Estonians, when they made their transition back in '92, went to e-government, that is, government over the internet as much as possible, which really reduced the opportunities for corruption. Mark Lahr, their first reform prime minister back in 1992, had been instrumental in putting that together. We also, the importance of property rights is extremely important. And Chile, under the so-called Chicago Boys, including our friend Jose Piñera, made drastic changes in terms of the importance of protecting private property. They did that about 40 years ago. And Chile went from a poor country to a rich country in a relatively short time. And in our film, it's explained how Chile managed to succeed by great extension and protection of private property, including subsurface rights for people who want to develop oil and gas and minerals underneath property. We feature Switzerland because Switzerland, to my mind, is the best governed country in the world. Can anybody here tell me who the Swiss president is? No. The reason you can't is most Swiss don't know either, because it's not important. It's because they have developed the policies and the institutions to manage their lives well. I mean, what the people do is really manage their own lives with more of a minimum of government. Government is conducted at the lowest level. They have very little corruption, reasonable taxes, but the taxes vary a lot from canton to canton, that is from section to section. So people can select what kind of tax rate they want, what kind of level of government services. They have reasonable regulations. They have a very sound currency. They're largely free trade and free markets. And as a result, Switzerland, without any access to the sea, surrounded by other countries who are doing less well, has become the most prosperous major country in Europe. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from Switzerland. Ukraine has many natural advantages that Switzerland does not have. For instance, you've got access to the sea, you have many more mineral resources, your agricultural lands are far more productive and valuable. And I think looking at the Swiss example will be highly beneficial for you. I tend to be an optimist, and that's why we have done these films on successful countries. It's very easy to understand why people are poor. That's no trick. To understand why people are wealthy is more difficult. But basically, people are wealthy when they operate under the rule of law, protect private property, reasonable taxes, free trade, free markets, minimal government regulation, and a sound currency. You provide that, and the entrepreneurial spirits of the people, like from all of you, that will generate the wealth. Wealth does not come from government. Government can destroy wealth, like we've seen in Venezuela now. But what governments cannot create the wealth. It is the private entrepreneurs who create the wealth. Government merely can set a correct set of rules and take away disincentives for bad behavior. With that, I'll turn it over to my next columnist.
May I just interrupt? I have seen that Barbara Kolm has arrived. Maybe she comes to the podium and just to say hello, that people know who she is. Just for 1 minute, please, Barbara. And just say hello.
Good morning, and apologies for being late. I had to fly to Munich yesterday to give for a TV show, and now I'm back here. Thank you. Welcome, and I would like to thank Tatiana for organizing this wonderful first stop here in Lviv. Thank you for hosting us. I see many students. Please be aware that you have to challenge our wonderful speakers. Really do that. Ask them as many questions as possible and make sure they answer all your questions. Our entire team is here to help, support, and debate with you, because after all, the goal of the roadshow is to not only share our European or our values, which means defending markets, preserving freedom, individual freedom, grow freedom, make sure the tax rates don't go too high, allow competitive environments to grow, and especially for you, for the next generation, to create a prosperous, wonderful country where you can have your families and grow not only your family, but grow a nation that is prosperous and free. And this is what we as pro-market people try to help establish. And again, thank you to Tatiana for hosting us here. We know this is an experiment for the first time being here, but it looks good. And I want to thank our speakers, our distinguished friends from Ukraine, from Lviv and all over, to join us and to debate with us. And of course, our international speakers you have already met. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will continue. Your 5 minutes, please.
Hello, I'm James Sproul. I was until last week the chief economist at the Institute of Directors in London. I'm still an economist in London, but happily traveling around Eastern Europe this week. I want to talk a bit about trade this morning, because I think that trade is one of those things which really underpins economic success in the longer term. And the more that countries like Ukraine are woven into the international trade pattern, I think the more successful you're going to be. Historically, of course, the more that countries trade, the richer and more prosperous they tend to be. The problem is always that despite we know that theoretically trade helps countries, a lot of times there's a temptation to come against that free trade, to raise protectionist barriers. And that's because the gains of free trade are given to everyone a little bit, whereas the problems of free trade, the protectionists, they can protect a very few people a lot. And that is an enormous challenge, because of course politically you can get a company, or maybe a steel company or a coal company, that says, I'm not asking you to disadvantage everybody, I just want you to help me. And that's fighting against that is an enormous problem all the time. And it's one that's common both Western Europe, America, and clearly here in Eastern Europe as well. So those gains are widespread and the pain is concentrated. Those countries that have overcome and become champions of free traders do have a number of things in common. One of them is that the prosperity they've gotten has usually come very quickly. And because they've grown quickly, they've been able to put a lot of free trade policies in place with a lot of popular support. For countries that have grown slowly, it's often been less popular for free trade. And that's the real challenge to you here in the Ukraine. And the faster you can grow, the more you're going to get people who support those open free markets. The lucky thing is that we're actually at a stage in global economic development when that rapid growth is possible in a way that it hasn't been before. And I think a lot of that, and I'll come on to it in a moment, is going to be due to what I call the intellectual revolution. I also wanted to say something very quickly about Brexit because I come from London and it's a debate I followed very, very, very closely, very passionately. The UK does want a very, very comprehensive free trade agreement. I don't think that trade has been the problem with Europe at all. I think there was a problem of a feeling for many British people of a European government, and we can argue and debate, perhaps afterwards, perhaps over lunch, as to can Europe have an effective pan-European government, or is it better to have governments at a more local level and still have free trade? So I'm going to close off on a couple of thoughts on some of the things I've observed from businesses going forward. In my role at the Institute of Directors, it was very, very interesting. We always saw the most dynamic companies were those that wanted to trade the most. The business executives that got out there and traveled around the world and figured out where they could add value were invariably the more successful companies. And I think that's a lesson for everybody here. As John so eloquently put, you now have the ability to travel that you didn't have a generation ago. And I think that you should make the absolute most of that. I also think there's a message here for government. Dynamic governments encourage trade. And really there's a couple of things. It's not about putting in place state subsidies for trade. It's about having a rule of law. And that rule of law is absolutely critical. And Richard was implying that. The reason, of course, is because big companies can always get around, they can negotiate with the government. But smaller companies cannot. They need that rule of law. They need a level playing field. And that's an incredibly important thing to actually getting your economy off the ground. And they also need a sympathetic ecosystem that helps and encourages trade. So no capital controls, for instance, ease of moving money in and out, ease of getting investors' money that can come into the country and leave if they decide to as well. I'm an enormous optimist about what's happening in the future. And I look now at what I was referring to, the intellectual revolution. The way that data is being driving our economy in future is going to change the way we all live. And there's an enormous number of opportunities as new companies come up, make use of that data to make use of the way that we can communicate. And I think there's an enormous opportunity for the Ukraine to be a great part of that prosperous global economy. Thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Denis Shmehal. I'm deputy of CEO of DTEC Zahid Energo. It's one of the biggest heat energy producing company in Ukraine. We are also big exporters, so we know what we are talking about when we speak about foreign trade contracts, when we are speaking about free trade. And before, for 5 years, I have spent and working for regional state administration, so represent Lviv region in international relations. We are on the beginning of our way of integration into the world economy. And a little bit than 1 year of free trade agreement with European Union, a little bit less than 1 year free trade agreement with Canada. We are on the beginning of our way of integration into the world trade, free trade market. And we have a hope that Ukraine will be very successfully integrated into this free trade market. And we do our best to be integrated into free trade market correctly and successfully. Unfortunately, now, according to the official data, only 280 enterprises and companies of Ukraine have permissions and certificates to export their production into the European Union. It's a crucially small quantity. Only 100 of these enterprises are working in sphere of agricultural and food industry. We are growing our export comparing to last year into 25%, but quantity of enterprises is crucially small, so it's mostly big companies and colleagues. My colleagues were speaking about actually this situation when big companies may use this situation, but small business is not including into this free market, big world market process. So our task now is protect small and middle businesses, to create good conditions for them. And I think that main challenges for Ukraine now are to create good infrastructure, good trade and industrial infrastructure, good roads, good ports, airports, points of custom control on our borders. We should finish our reforms in sphere of good and European standards legislation. We should finish our court reform and create fair court system. This is crucially important for foreign investors and for development of our economy and industry. So I hope that this way, it will be way in both sides, in import and export, and we will win in this situation. Thank you. And
hi everybody, my name is Andrei Ionov. I'm living in Lviv. I'm doing business in the field of restaurants. In the former times, I was an industrial manager and I was CEO of Lviv Insulator Plant as well. And also I was a CEO in investment company here in Lviv. And I would like to thank all organizers of this event who invited me to participate here. Dear friends, we are living in the city, which was native city for Mises, and also for another great man, the surname is Kotorbinsky. He was a philosopher and he was the founder of the new science of praxeology. And the Kotorbinsky in his studies wrote that each interaction between persons and people is a cooperation, but the cooperation may be negative and positive. And the aim and the goal of the politician is to organize such way of behavior when the rate of positive cooperation is rising and the rate of negative cooperation is going down. So if we'll think about what is going on with free trade and with free trade market, we need to estimate what is the level of positive cooperation on the market. Is it transparent or no? Unfortunately, I must say that it seems to me that the level of positive cooperation in Europe is not too much high. And I don't see the messages which will show us the future of growing of such positive cooperation. And for politicians, it's necessary to do everything in order to improve this situation. What is the vital today, as for me? The vital are the values, especially the value of freedom, as the conscious possibility of choice. How to do the conscious choice? First of all, we must have the proper information. And the challenge which we have now is based on a lie and non-truth. And there are a lot of examples. Let's say like a famous TripAdvisor. When you can look on the TripAdvisor announcements, you will find the names of the restaurants on the first rates, which doesn't correspond to the high quality. And the people receiving this information are misinformed, and they can't behave in a proper way. And there is a gap between the truth and non-truth, especially with the politicians, which are lobbying different ideas which are not based on a truth approach. They are simply doing their own interests. We now in Ukraine in a very hard challenged position when our parliament is discussing the future of our land. And the discussion is that it is necessary to privatize the land, and that is the demand of International Monetary Fund. From one side, it is okay, the private property on the land. From another side, the huge companies will come here and will lose small and middle business. Will have no chance to develop our economy. In my opinion, the insistence on the privatization of the land for the large companies is inappropriate for Ukraine in this period of time. I think that it's necessary to develop the farmers sector in order to improve the trade and to accelerate the free market approach. Another thing that in Ukraine we don't see any messages which give us the possibility to believe that our industrial sector will grow. There is no marks. If so, then we would have, let's say, the elimination of VAT on import of the equipment for investment into the statute capital, as well as the custom duties. But there is no marks that our politicians are thinking about this. There are a lot of challenges. And the example of Estonia, as it was told here, is very interesting. But at the same time, I must say that Estonia is a Protestant country with its own experience and paradigm. We're living in a little bit another situation with Orthodox paradigm, and this Orthodox paradigm causes another approaches. So we must do ourselves. We must find our own solutions in cooperation with Europe, in cooperation with other countries of the world. We must do something in order to make greater the values of each person, each micro and micro socium and socium in the whole. So thank you so much for attention.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Daniel Kadik. I'm the director of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for Southeast Europe, for Bulgaria, Romania, Macedonia, and Moldova. And as you can hear from that, it's not necessarily my region that I'm in here right now, but I'm very tempted to already disagree with the last statement. I work in 4 countries, and I've been working in India and so many other places. And one thing I always hear is, yeah, that won't work here because we're special in some way or another. Yes, and there might be certain particularities about the countries, but the basic principles of economy and of trade remain the same wherever you go. The only question is how you package it and how you sell it in the end of the day. And the question of, and I will sit down again because it will be a long day for me as well, especially when we're talking about the major reconfiguration, we're talking about change and we're talking about adaptation. And especially in the last 27 years, we have seen unprecedented change in economy, in politics. And change is ever more rapid. Information is flowing ever faster. And the perceived reality becomes ever more complex because you see so much more of the world. And just imagine the fact that mankind has been making more progress in the last 100 years than in the 100,000 years before that. Just try to let that sink in for just a second. And one more amazing fact is that the countries of the EU have had the longest period without trying to bash each other's heads in. Also something that's unprecedented so far. And one thing that enabled that was trade, because there was a French philosopher called Bastiat that said, paraphrased, if goods can't cross borders, so soldiers will. So this trade, and this trade of the part of the European freedoms, the exchange of goods, people and capital, the European Union has expanded the personal economic freedom across national borders. It has enabled growth by trade. And if you look at Germany, for instance, a country that was completely in ruin, and we just talked about it on the airplane, was rigid. It was completely obliterated. There was nothing left there. But we had friends from the United States that helped us, that opened their economy for our products, that helped us build our economy again. And now it's the strongest economy in Europe. You have countries like Taiwan, that when I was young, well, I have to say no, when I was your age, the only thing you could get from Taiwan were these little plastic figurines that said made in Taiwan. And now if you think of what kind of products come from Taiwan, these are computers and microchips. And this was because Taiwan opened its markets for foreign companies to come in and to start exporting. But again, this means exposure. You expose yourself to the world. And that means people have to make sense of information. And it also means that there's change happening because, well, the world because you trade, you exchange goods and services, you exchange ideas. So that means change. And the great liberal philosopher and politician and former chairman of my foundation, Lord Ralph Dahrendorf, examined that question already 20 years ago. In 1997, he looked at globalization and its social consequences. On the one hand, he sees tremendous chances and hopes for millions from the unifying power of trade and exchange. But he also predicted something that we see now, the rise of neo-regionalism that seeks to retreat into more closed environments out of fear of an increasingly complex global economic world. A mass retreat that seeks salvation in nation-states, regions, or religious communities. And it's dangerous, and the messages of populists and isolationists fall on fertile ground. Look at polls from any country. People think that their lives are getting worse. And that is simply not true. You see worldwide, with some local exceptions, unprecedented living standards, life expectancy, health, and education. In the last 50 years, world poverty has fallen more than it did in the previous 500. Still, 71% of Brits think the world is getting worse. Only 5% think it's improving. And if you ask Americans whether global poverty has remained the same, doubled, or fallen by half, only 5% are able to give the right answer. If you would let a chimpanzee randomly pick numbers, it would have a higher success rate picking the right answer for that question. And it's no wonder we are always told that the world is getting worse. There's climate change, there's war, there's terrorism, you name it. And it's accompanied, especially in the West, by a social industry that lives on this kind of bad news. And they are engaging in shadow discussion that completely divert from the real problems of the world. But the world is not getting worse, it's getting more complex. Information is getting fast and people have to make change of it. Again, mankind has made more progress in the last 100 years than in the last 100,000. Jobs that have not existed 15 years ago are now there. Jobs that have been existing for hundreds of years have vanished. And that creates fear in people. And just to close, one thing that has a very unholy role in that is the media. Because people usually made sense of looking at the media, but now media is only providing information. And the problem there is that bad information is selling better than good. So nobody cares about the 40 million airplanes that land safely each year. It's the one that doesn't that makes the news. And that, again, creates the sense of uncertainty. Last but not least, populism is one of the consequences. People being more afraid, having to make sense of more things. And it's easy for them to make others scapegoat and tell other people that they don't have to adapt. However, French and Greeks are not suffering from German austerity, they're suffering from a lack of adaptability of their countries. They're suffering of their countries not being able to adapt to a changing world. Adaptation is the key, not closing borders. The abstract idea of greatness of a nation connecting with closing borders for goods and people will hurt the countries in the end, not being able to sell their comparative advantages and using those of others. Finally, we're in an ever-connected world. Countries are not islands, even though the UK is an island. But it's not an island in the vast sea of globalization. So the key is adaptation and collaboration, not closing others out. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these interesting statements. I may open the discussion, question and answer. We have 25 minutes to go. As Barbara has said, don't be shy, just ask. There are distinguished speakers, also from Ukraine, but from 2 continents of the world. So please, who has a question? I hope there is a microphone. Otherwise, there is no possibility to translate. Is there a microphone for the people who are asking? Okay, please stand up. Just a moment, you need a microphone. Stand up, tell who you are, and if it is not really possible in English, you may do it in Ukrainian as well, because we have translation.
Good morning. My name is Igor Hornyak. I am a professor associated from Lviv National Ivan Franko University. I have one small comment and one question to the Richard Penn run, maybe, for the first. My first comment will be for the first report. I cannot agree that Ukraine has today civil war. We don't have any civil war. We have civil conflict. We have war with Russia. It's my opinion, and it's opinion I am sure all citizens that are living in this city for the first. And my question is for the Richard Run. Do you agree with Joseph Stiglitz? Joseph Stiglitz is sure that creation of oligarchy in Russia and Ukraine is the work of International Monetary Fund. Then, after such not clever position, not clever claims for the privatization without market instruments, IMF created such very bad thing for these 2 states. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
The first part was about the Civil War. Okay. I knew this would happen. And I said what I said in order to provoke the exact response that you gave, in order to make it clearer as to why Ukraine does not always communicate with the rest of the world as well as it might. I was very clear and specific in what I said. I talked about the Russian incursions, and then I said, and I was very careful in what I said both a civil war and an invasion. An invasion means by a foreign power. In Ukraine, you have 2 things that happened recently. You had citizens of Ukraine siding with a foreign power, doing its bidding, and engaging in activities against the government and the people of Ukraine. You also had Russian citizens, disguised as civilians or disguised as little green men, and driving Russian vehicles, invading the country. One of the things that Russian propaganda is very clear about is, if you are not specific and you are not clear, and you simply say, it is simply an invasion, and there's no distinction, there's no shading, there's no nuance, they will use that to discredit you and say, aha, that's why when they interview people on Russian television who happen to be citizens of Ukraine, and they say, we are citizens of Ukraine, we are fighting for our rights as Russian speakers. You have to be more precise and more careful in what you say in describing your conflict than they do. You have to live to a higher standard of accuracy and a higher standard. If you don't, you leave your opponents the opportunity and the opening to nitpick at you. So you must be precise in your facts, and I was very precise. Of course Russia invaded Ukraine. It is also true that there are citizens of Ukraine who speak Russian who have taken sides with Russia and are favoring Russian interests. That is the textbook dictionary definition of civil conflict.
Okay, it's civil conflict. Good.
I don't think that the IMF created the oligarchs. I'm a critic of the IMF. I think they do a lot of things poorly. They give a lot of bad advice, and I have been on the record for saying they ought to largely be defunded. They should go out of business. The IMF, like so many international institutions, was set up for a particular purpose. That purpose either was not achieved or achieved. In the case of the IMF, it was set up to manage the gold standard under Bretton Woods, and in 1972, when we formally went off the gold standard, it really should have gone out of business at that time, but instead, like good bureaucrats, it found a new role for itself, and much of what it's done, again, I don't think it's been very beneficial, in many cases, downright destructive, particularly in encouraging countries to have higher taxes than they should. Their whole focus has been on fiscal balance rather than economic growth. And economic growth is the key. Answer the question?
Thank you very much. One request in between. We should stick a little bit more to our topic and not talk just politics and Russia, etc. This is known by everyone. There was a question, please.
My name is Vitaly Horelik. I'm running a small company, Spectrographical Limited in Lviv, and represent a huge transnational corporation, Saint-Gobain High Performance Materials in Ukraine and in Belarus Republic. The central point of today's discussion remains the rule of law, as for me, for a businessman, because this is a key question now under consideration by all of our reformers. My question to this respectable delegation, would it be realizable, would it be realistic to outsource the Western high-developed courts for civil cases here in Ukraine? Would it be possible? Is it realistic? Can you tell us about some examples worldwide? Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm a great advocate of farming out the court system in terms of training. I have worked with a number of offshore entities. I mentioned I've been on the board of the Cayman Island Monetary Authority. Cayman, of course, is a very small entity, but it does bring in judges from other British Commonwealth countries, such as New Zealand and Canada and so forth. A number of countries over the years have actually brought in judges, foreign judges, both to teach people how good judging should take place and about the rule of law. Back, I had chaired the Bulgarian transition team back in 1990, and we were trying to get the Bulgarians at that time to bring in foreign judges because they had a lot of corruption in their judicial system. I think Ukraine would be well advised to bring in foreign judges from jurisdictions that are known for integrity, honesty, and competency. One problem is you have, of course, the administrative law as opposed to the British common law, and particularly in financial matters, the world operates really on British common law.
After James, I just had a very brief after James.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the whole role of finance, of course, because particularly for Europe, London is clearly Europe's financial capital. If you want to raise significant sums of money, you're invariably going to go to the London capital markets to do so. When you go to the London capital markets, you will be under, almost invariably, the contract will be under English law, and that's because English law is particularly good for a lot of financial transactions. It has a lot of case law that sits there. The lawyers understand it. They can do that. And, of course, an enormous number of financings that take place in London are nothing to do with the United Kingdom. They are to do with other parts of Europe, other parts of the world. So there is an effective global standard there, which is English law. So in that area, at least, just what you've said in terms of people farming out, an important part of business has happened.
I couldn't agree more with Richard and James, but obviously there are political, cultural, and nationalistic obstacles to this. At one point, Singapore was willing to have British Commonwealth judges make rulings in their civil and criminal courts. Over time, they decided, well, we can do this ourselves. Well, you're not Singapore, and you have to perhaps have a different approach. Here you can look to the Ukrainian diaspora. As you know, there are 50 million Ukrainians, but there are almost as many or more outside of Ukraine. Canada has 5 or 6 million Ukrainian Canadians. So you don't even have to look to Ukrainians in the United States. The Baltic states, Poland, several other countries, after the fall of communism, benefited greatly from people who had connections to the home country coming and lending their expertise. In some cases, especially in the Baltic countries, that included people advising their military. In fact, for a while, one of the leaders of a nation in the Baltic states' military was a former United States Army colonel. The judges were often trained by people from Western countries who were of Ukrainian background, who spoke Ukrainian, and that increased the comfort level a great deal. So you didn't feel as if these decisions or this training was imposed by another country or another society. It was from people who had fled your country, or their parents or their grandparents had fled because of the obvious dictatorship and oppression. So you can still at any time take advantage of the Ukrainian diaspora. You obviously have to have people that you trust and vet and people that you have confidence in, but that might be one thing to look at, to have people, retired judges from Canada, from Britain, from France, from Argentina. Argentina has a large Ukrainian community. Bring them in for short periods of time, fixed periods of time, to judge civil cases, and you may dramatically increase the confidence in your investment decisions and your enforcement of the rule of law, as well as your ability to learn and hone exactly what kind of commercial codes you need to attract more foreign investment.
Thank you very much. Let me have one statement on that. It's evident that the judicial system has to be reformed. But the question is not so much how. The question is, how can you make it happen? Yeah? And not whom to take, etc. Any further questions? Please.
Thank you. Yuri Tishkun, Lviv Polytechnic National University. The question in the context of war and traditional economical liberalism of Ludwig von Mises. Former head of security service, Yevgen Marchuk, said on the last security conference that President Poroshenko signed the act of proclaiming of state of war in Ukraine, but without filling of date. And if the situation will happen, we will have a serious problem for economy. Full mobilization of conscripts, mobilization of transport, and mobilization of plants and factories for military needs. You as advisors with experience, how you can say, how we can answer on this problem if we proclaim the state of war, how we can combine it with a free market and with free security zone with European Union. Thank you.
Okay, any answer? I've got an opinion, but panelists have to speak. You can't. Sorry, if I may answer.
I will just say briefly, it's an excellent question. Hilaire Belloc, the philosopher, once said that war is the health of the state, that whenever you have conditions of war, you provide excuses using a state of emergency for all kinds of restrictions on economic activity, economic freedom, the dragooning, the marshalling of resources on behalf of the state, taking private property for public purpose to fight the war without compensation. You have many dangers. Obviously, Ukraine has challenges that other countries in the post-communist world don't have. That's why the rule of law is so important. If the government needs to intervene in the economy, it must do so based on the rule of law. It must pay for the goods that it commands or the resources it demands for the war. Just because you have a war doesn't mean the basic laws of nature, economy, and justice are suspended. They may have to be adapted, but you must follow the kind of rule of law that gives people confidence that the country you have at the end of the war is going to be prosperous and free and respected in the world for how it dealt with the war in a fashion that can make it proud and gives everyone assurance that no matter what the state of emergency, certain norms will be preserved and obeyed.
Thank you. Any further questions, please? Barbara. Just in the back.
I would simply ask probably Richard to elaborate a little bit on examples where states where I would not say failed, but who were in difficulties, in serious difficulties, have made changes, brought about changes on systems where we can kind of not copy paste, but what we can learn and look at. Zetas in Honduras might be an opportunity, but many other things where you bring in legal systems or where you can look at examples. I think this is a way where we can further elaborate.
There's an old rule, don't reinvent what is already known and working. We know why successful economies are successful. I mentioned Switzerland. Barbara just mentioned the idea of free cities. There's an experiment going now in Honduras, and Barbara chairs that group to look at development of free cities there. The question is, will the government actually give enough freedoms that these can be developed as demonstrations? You have Hong Kong was the ultimate free city demonstration for China. And China saw how well Hong Kong was doing relative to the mainland. So China set up hundreds of free cities themselves, including places like Shenzhen, which went from 13,000 people to 14 million, an incredible success story. We have, again, I mentioned Chile. 40 years ago, it was basically somewhat of a Marxist dictatorship, and now it is free, and prosperous, a great place. Recommend you go there. I was just in South Korea last week. You could get no more stark example of the difference between policies and institutions. On the Korean Peninsula, you have the identical people by genetic makeup, by language, by history. North Korea has no freedoms. South Korea, 35 years ago, decided to free up the economy and go for trade and protection of private property, the rule of law, and so forth. Right now, the people in South Korea have 21 times the per capita income of North Korea and 52 times the total GDP. It's astounding. Seoul, Korea goes right up to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, the suburbs. You go up there, and you're in Seoul, which is a developed city, a rich city, higher per capita incomes in South Korea than in Spain and Italy. And you look over to North Korea, which is just painfully, dreadfully, tragically, criminally poor. And you see the difference in policies and institutions. Any country can become wealthy within a generation or two. And I've been around long enough to actually see this, watch countries go from being poor to rich countries. You can do it in 20, 30 years. You grow 10% a year. For 7 years, you double your GDP. And there's a lot of countries who have done that around the world. And in fact, if I were Ukrainians, I would hold my leaders' feet to the fire and say, we want to grow rapidly. There's no reason why Ukraine cannot grow 10% per year. And if you did that, after 20, 30 years, you're going to be as rich as any country in Western Europe.
Yeah, I've done a fair amount of looking at what I call a failed modern developed nation. So we've got lots of failed nations around the world, of places that have been extremely poor for many, many centuries, like Somalia and things like that. But it's different if you're a rich country and you become poor. And I think there's 4 things that tend to typify a country that's on its way to being failed, even if they have been at one point rich. First of all, of course, the people who know the country best are the people who live there. And when people who live in a country won't invest in that country, when they take every opportunity to take whatever money they have and move it to some other country, that's a vote of no confidence. And that's a thing to worry about. You then tend to find that investors won't go to that country because they look at it and think, if the locals won't invest in it, why should I? These are people who know the country better than me. Despite the fact that things might appear cheap, I'm worried about the government taking my things away from me, so a rule of law, that type of thing tends to get undermined. The next thing that tends to happen is people like yourselves leave. Young people look at the country and they say, there's no hope for me here. I don't see a long-term prosperous future, and you may not want to be the next billionaire, but people do have ambitions about what they want to achieve in their lives. And if you can't see any hope domestically, you leave. And many people do. And finally, it tends to have a lot of security problems because you have a society that's on the road to breaking down, and that tends to be security problems, whether that be police or more military. It's also possible, of course, to turn this around. Now, there's a country I know very well, Ireland, which has gone through a transition like this. In 1923, Ireland left the United Kingdom. Between 1923 and 1982, so 2 generations, the Irish economy essentially did not grow. It was either in recession or stagnating for 2 entire generations. All the money left, all the youth left, nobody invested in it. And the Irish eventually said to themselves, we need to change this. And they put in a whole series of laws that were very, very liberal in an economic sense, in terms of you can bring your money in, you can take it at any time, very, very low taxation, extremely low taxation, and very, very friendly to setting up of companies. Finally, of course, in a situation like Ireland, you need a bit of luck. And sometimes this is overlooked both in people's personal lives and also in the lives and development of countries. It's not enough to just be a tempting place or more tempting than neighbors, because if somebody has to shut down their existing factory, their existing business to move to you, that's kind of hard. I sometimes say to students, it's a bit like trying to attract a boyfriend or a girlfriend who's already dating somebody else and they're happy. It takes a lot of effort to get them to come away from where they are to you. Much better to go for somebody who's already single. It's a bit easier to convince them that you're wonderful. The same thing happens, and what happened in Ireland's case is we had an information technology revolution, and the Irish were very, very good at convincing businesses that were looking to invest. They were looking for that partner, and they decided that that partner should be in Ireland. So I would say to the Ukraine, you've got to match up your own, be a tempting place for people to come to, and then a bit of luck is going to help, because you do need people to be looking to invest as well, because it's very difficult to tempt people away from existing businesses. So.
We've got just a few minutes left. A last question. Please.
Very simple questions. Maybe looking at the experience of Argentina, with some crash after currency board crash, these reforms. Looking at the experience of Malaysia, of South Korea, etc. Maybe could we talk about it about this fact that without market institute and institutions, without market mechanism, is it no chance for the state really to compete? In case of Ukraine, if you don't have real, proper market institute and institutions, we can talk about Chamber of Commerce. I also worked in Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce approximately 10 years. If you talk about absence of such institutes and institutions, if you talk about some absence of real liberal economy in the world, because USA is not liberal economy, European Union is not liberal economy, they all have some restrictions. If you talk about such restrictions, maybe Ukraine, with no such proper mechanisms, without normal fund market, have no chance in such free market. Do you agree with me? Thank you.
One panelist, 2 minutes, please.
A country doesn't have to do everything correctly. But you've got to do enough stuff so that people will want to invest. The one emphasis I'd put on, I'm an economist, but I learned painfully that if you don't have the rule of law, nothing else works. In Bulgaria, when we first went there in 1990, we made a lot of reforms, except the courts were still corrupt, and that corruption held back the country. We put in a good tax system, we did the privatization and so forth. But without rule of law, nothing else works. So that has to be the primary thing. You can have imperfect trade policy. You mentioned the U.S. Well, taxes are higher than I think us Americans on the panel would like. We've got too much regulation. We're reversing some of that now. We're not purely free trade, but we're close enough. We did enough things better than most other countries. You mentioned Russia. I'm somewhat pessimistic about Russia. It is still an economy based on selling natural resources. That's not a good long-run strategy. Natural resources over time fall in real price. And you don't have examples really of sustained development in terms of a diversified economy. Yeah, places like Saudi Arabia, they'll live for a long time on the amount of oil, but Russia's population is a whole lot bigger than Saudi Arabia's, and there are just limits to how far you can go with that. So again, institutions are absolutely key. The rule of law, there is no substitute for that. I can design an ideal economic program, and if you don't have rule of law, it won't work.
Thank you very much. Our time is up. Thank you for participating. If I'm not wrong, we will have a short break, and we can certainly continue some of these questions and answers in the break. Thank you very much.